Good evening and a very warm welcome to our January 3rd Thursday lecture, the first lecture of the year. And so I would like to take this opportunity to wish all of our participants and audience a very happy new year. My name is Eugenia Bogdanova-Kumar. I'm a lecturer of Japanese arts and cultures here at the Sainsbury Institute for the Study of Japanese Arts, Cultures and Heritage. It is my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Jonathan Zwicker to our online lecture this evening. Dr. Zwicker will be delivering a talk titled Kabuki's 19th Century, Stage and Print in Early Modern Edo. Dr. Zwicker is Associate Professor of Japanese Literature and Agassiz Chair in Japanese in the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures at the University of California, Berkeley. He is the author of Practices of the Sentimental Imagination, Melodrama, the Novel, and the Social Imaginary in 19th Century Japan from Harvard Asia Center in 2006, and of Kabuki's 19th Century, Stage and Print in Early Modern Edo from Oxford in 2023. This evening, his talk will explore the themes covered in his latest publication on Kabuki and print culture in the 19th century. The talk will re-examine the theater of the 19th century by shifting our critical focus from performance to print and the public sphere, and exploring how theatricality and performance circulated beyond the stage through printed matter of the time. This archive of material provides an important subject to inquiry to better understand both performance of the time as well as the interrelations between and among various printed media and genres beyond the theater in 19th century Edo. This session will run until around 19 o'clock UK time, followed by a Q&A session of around 10 minutes. On your screen, you will see there are two different text boxes. One in the chat box and the other one in the Q&A at the bottom of the screen. Please post your questions to Dr. Zwicker in the Q&A box. You can post these throughout the lecture or during the Q&A session in the end. I'm now going to pass the floor to Dr. Zwicker. Thank you for joining us, and so we're looking forward to the talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to first of all thank Dr. Matsuba for her invitation to participate in this series, and also Dr. Bogdanova Kumar for her kind introduction. And I'd also like to thank Olivia Butler for all of her help with getting this set up and the logistics. I'd like to begin by saying a brief word about this image. Which was the image used to advertise this talk. It comes from a series of prints that the print designer Toyohara Chikanobu did in 1889 titled Gento Shashinkyo, which might be rendered into English as something like a magic lantern which reflects that which is in one's heart or mind. Of course, the shin of this shashin is not the shin that we would normally associate with shashin as in photography, but the character for heart or mind. This particular print is titled Shibai, or theater, and here we see a young woman conjuring up in her mind an actor in the role of Nikki Danjo, one of the great villains of the Kabuki stage. And a series of illustrated books is, of course, spread out before her. This image frames in very clear ways many of the themes that I'd like to talk about today and that I addressed at more length in my book on Kabuki's 19th century, the relation between stage and print, between image and actor, the role of the reader or consumer, and finally, how all of these problems often intersect with issues of gender and class across the 19th century. The philosopher Henri Gouillet has argued that a dual temporality is fundamental to the theater as art. Like music, that is, theater is of two moments, the moment of composition and the moment of performance. I'd like to suggest a third moment that relates to, in often messy and complicated ways, the moments of composition and performance, and that is the circulation of the theater and print. To be sure, the vexed relationship between performance and its record, between repertoire and archive, has long been fundamental to the discipline of performance studies, for which the ephemerality of the performance is in many ways a central disciplinary concern. Book history, for its part, has also taken up the problem of how print provides an afterlife to dramatic works, which as performance are by their very nature ephemeral. David Caston, the Shakespearean, for example, has described the way in which Shakespeare is preserved in print. It's not an entirely happy metaphor, Caston concedes, living beings are preferable to mummies, and print, in any case, does not preserve language as firmly as formaldehyde preserves bodies. Nonetheless, without print, there's no Shakespeare for all time. My own interest, the print culture of 19th century Kabuki, is somewhat different. What we have left are not the plays themselves, which were in general not printed or published until the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century, and now survive, if at all, in often fragmentary manuscripts, but rather an enormous amount of printed theater ephemera, playbills and broadsheets, actor prints and rankings, lists of salaries, illustrated novels, maps, and so forth. For much of the 20th century, this material was collected and preserved and has been treated primarily as a kind of indexical or documentary archive. That is to say, it points to the performance. The material has been considered as I mentioned, primarily indexical, pointing elsewhere to the ever-vanishing performance of which it is some kind of material remainder. In the remarks that follow, I'd like to take a different tack, treating these materials not as evidence of the practices of performance, but as a particular medium of circulation, a medium that bears a complicated relationship to the performance it purports to record and preserve, necessitating a recalibration of the history of the interrelationship among the ephemerality of performance, the archive of printed ephemera, and now in the 21st century, the transformation of that archive in the context of our digital environment. So much is the larger context, the subject of my book on Kabuki's 19th century. Today, I would like to enter this subject by considering the role that printed images played in the early 19th century as one site for thinking about this relationship of stage and print. One of the central figures in my book, though one not typically associated with Kabuki, is the writer Shite Samba. And I'd like to use an image from his 1811 work of illustrated fiction, which was illustrated by Utagawa Toyokuni. The title of this work is Sono Utsushie Kabuki no Omokage, or Shadows of Kabuki Cast by Magic Lantern. I'd like to use this image to frame the problem of how both writers and illustrators began to interrogate the relationship between stage and print in the early 19th century, and why, in this time, it was that this relationship came to be seen as ambivalent and vexed, not like how it has been theorized in recent decades. This is roughly halfway through Shadows of Kabuki, and quite literally disrupts the narrative flow of the work. At the top of the page, as the top of the page notes, the page represents an image that shows the plot by means of eitoki. Eitoki being a practice with a history going back at least to the 10th century, in which a storyteller uses images, to explain otoku, a story of a Buddhist principle. What's interesting is the way that Samba uses this conceit, is that he spatializes plot, laying out on the page various moments in the narrative, some taking place simultaneously, some sequentially, as a way to explain the relationship among the various strands of the complex plot. And while Samba here invokes the tradition of eitoki, what the image most closely resembles is the page of an illustrated playbill. A common form of printed ephemera in the early 19th century, and a form of ephemera that Samba himself was an avid collector of. As Samba writes in the note to the reader that accompanies this image, the page represents a kind of suture stitch, linking together the first and second halves of the narrative by interweaving a series of events that Samba claims could not otherwise be fit into the book. So, for example, at the center here, we have the debauched priest, Hokkaibo, in the process of substituting the scroll he has been using to raise funds for a new temple bell for the famed carp scroll, the treasure of the Toshima family, done in the hand of the Han Emperor Wu, which had been stolen by the retainers of the villain Kodama Hangan. To the lower right, we see Kodama Hangan dispatching his retainers Ihozaki and Gyuhei to search for the fugitive Tono Inosuke, the scion of the Toshima house, and his betrothed Nowake Hime, which are over here. who are hiding to the left in the Miuraya and pledging to meet again when the bell tolls midnight. Of course, they are here being overheard by Hokkaibo, who's appearing right for the second time in this image. And above this, we have Kodoma's retainers questioning the wicked Muen Baba up here, searching, and her henchmen while searching for the fugitive couple. One thing that is striking with this page and the work as a whole is the centrality of images within images. That is to say, the place of various image-bearing scrolls and the importance that they have for the plot of this story. So, for example, the toll of the scroll of the bell, and then, of course, the image of the fugitive. I'll return to the function of images later, but for now, I'd like to focus not on image, but on text, on the apostrophe to the reader in the upper right hand of the page, which reads as follows. This work of fiction brings together in 7 volumes that which ought to be a work of 12 volumes, so that there are too many developments and not words enough. As this work is based on the plot of a Kabuki play, it's quite intricate and wholly impossible to fit onto 35 sheets of paper, and there are many places where I've had to stitch things together. The larger plot of the story revolves around the work of light and shadows, and how the casting of a magic lantern-like light exposes the doppelganger existence that lurks within certain characters. But the magic lantern also becomes a metaphor for the written work in relation to the performance. As the title, Shadows of Kabuki Cast by Magic Lantern, suggests, the work also thinks, at some moments quite self-consciously, about the role of print as a kind of shadow cast by the play. At one level, Samba's work highlights the disjuncture between what transpires on stage and the ability of the medium of print to capture performance and to preserve it. And yet, as a trope in 19th century Japanese fiction, the magic lantern also serves an important function. It's often, and in Samba's Shadows of Kabuki it is as well, the shadow cast by the magic lantern that exposes the real, rather than that which is merely visible to the naked eye. The printed page is at one level an inadequate medium for preserving performance, and yet the text suggests a different possibility, that the shadow cast by the performance is in some ways more real than the performance itself. Indeed, when at the beginning of his preface, Samba urges his readers to take this novel in hand, its plot is that of a well-written Kabuki script, he seems self-consciously to be pointing to the printed book as a material object which can be grasped by hand and as he notes in the preface, can be read and reread. But while Samba invokes on more than one occasion the idea that this book is an adaptation of a Kabuki play, the relationship between the play and the work of illustrated fiction is far from straightforward. And indeed, one of the interesting things about Samba's complaint here is that it seems intentionally misleading. Although Shadows of Kabuki is ostensibly based on the play Sumidagawa Gonichi no Omokage, or Latter-day Shadows of the Sumida River, which had been staged the previous year at the Morita Theater, Samba's work actually seems to add quite a bit of material that does not appear in any of the surviving prints or playbills related to the 1810 staging. As one example, there's a character of Kurikara no Kengoro, a knight errant who slays Kodama, and Hokkaibo, who recovers the carp scroll and helps vanquish the possessed spirit of the priest. In Shadows of Kabuki, he's a central character. In fact, in many ways, he's the central character of the novel, and he's depicted using the likeness of Matsumoto Koshiro V, one of the great actors of the day, who's easily identifiable by his hooked nose. But this character does not appear in the play, nor was Koshiro involved in the 1810 production. He was indeed contracted that year to the rival Ichimuraza, where he played the outlaw Ishikawa Goemon during the spring staging of the play Sanmon Gosan no Kiri. So what then are we to make of Samba's play of light and shadow, of a title that makes a central claim about the ontology of print and performance that has otherwise only an oblique connection to the work itself? Or of the apparent ambivalence located in Samba's apostrophe to the reader, that his own work is a kind of shadow cast by the stage, but that perhaps this shadow is more real than the performance on which it is based. To understand these problems, I'd like to return to the role of images in this work and to a broader discussion of the function of images and representations of the stage in the culture of early 19th century Japan. There's an interesting homology in this work that revolves around the ways in which likeness is conceptualized and used. We can see this at two levels. First, we have the use of actors' images to illustrate the work, a practice that would become ubiquitous in the second decade of the 19th century, but one that with which writers and illustrators and publishers had just begun to experiment with at the turn of the 19th century. Here, as the use of Matsumoto Koshiro's likeness suggests, the images appear to point beyond the page to the book, a page of the book, to a real actor, even if not in a role that he played on stage. So, for example, that is used in the illustration in the book is the same likeness used in the actor print. It's the same likeness used to show Koshiro off stage. But then there's also the use of likeness within Shadows of Kabuki, specifically how the use of what is described in the text as ninsogaki, the image-bearing scroll used to search for the fugitive couple. Here, there's an interesting conceit. For while ninsogaki were indeed used in the Edo period to search for criminals, these broadsheets simply carried a description of the criminal in words, with no images. And the earliest known use of likeness in this context comes from almost half a century after Shadow of Kabuki, a flyer printed by the shogunate in 1857, bearing the images of Takasugi, Shinsaku, Hiramu, Kuniomi, and Saigo Takamori, three of the central figures in anti-Bakufu movements. The scroll in Shadows of Kabuki, then, is itself a kind of fiction, though one, importantly, with real efficacy in the story. When Muen Baba discovers Tono Inosuke and Nowaki Hime hiding among the courtesan, along with the courtesan Miyato, it's the scroll that confirms their identities. Image within the image is what allows the couple and to understand who they are. Within the plot of the story, the image, that is readily legible as the likeness of the two figures it depicts, pointing towards an idea of mimesis. Muen Baba can identify the lovers because, as she says in the story, it is just as shown here. The young man is a young woman's lover, Tono Inosuke, and the woman is none other than Nowaki Hime. But the question of legibility, in fact, hung over images in the first decades of the 19th century and becomes a major theme within writing on the stage, and was a central preoccupation of both Samba and of Utagawa Toyokuni, the illustrator of Shadows of Kabuki. In 1817, Toyokuni would publish a short drawing manual, a quick guide to actors' likenesses. And this book is suggestive of a way to frame the problem of legibility in Shadows of Kabuki and to understand it within a broader context of image making in the early 19th century. Two things are central to Toyokuni's understanding of compositional practice as he presents it in his quick guide. The ability of the print designer to capture what is distinctive about the face of the actor he wished to represent, what Toyokuni refers to at several different points in this work as kusei, a sort of marker of individuality or distinctiveness, and the legibility of that representation to the viewer. Thus, as it's framed within Hayageko, the individuality of the face is linked to two other interrelated concerns, reproducibility and legibility. The very idea of the quick guide of a book on the technique of actors' likenesses is premised on the notion of reproducibility. In the first instance, that the actor's face can be reproduced as a likeness, and a likeness made possible, as Toyokuni stresses, by the existence of individuality and distinctiveness. And in the second instance, that the techniques of likeness can be learned and reproduced by the reader of the book. But the local problem of the amateur's ability to reproduce the actor's likeness, too, needs to be seen against the backdrop of a more generalized problem of reproducibility. Not only were block printed actor prints themselves intended to be reproduced on a large scale, but the actor's image too would be more generally reproduced in books and in prints and in all manner of printed ephemera, including a type of broadsheet in which the actor's image was linked to his rank and salary. Within this spectrum of block printed material, we can see the importance of the distinctiveness of the actor's face, that he can be easily recognized in terms of his own individuality across a variety of printed media, regardless of who is responsible for the print design. That is to say, different members of the Utagawa school can be drawing the images, but they would all point, regardless of who's responsible for them, to the same actor. Indeed, the individuality of the face is in some ways premised on facing the individuality of the designer's brush, the very problem that would later be pointed to in stylistic critiques of Toyokuni, that his work was indistinguishable from that of many of his students, which always raises the specter of inauthenticity. But in conjunction with reproducibility, there's also the problem of legibility, a problem that Toyokuni himself flags in a quick guide, and that also emerges in a variety of writings concerning the actor's image in the early 19th century. If the actor's likeness is not legible as the likeness of the actor, identifiable by the reproduction of certain distinctive features, Matsumoto Koshiro's nose, for example, or Iwai Hanshiro's curled lower lip, then the likeness itself has no meaning. Or as Toyokuni puts it in his quick guide, because a likeness should allow you to distinguish who is whom, and the way that you draw will depend on little differences in the eyebrows, eyes, nose, and mouth, please savor this book that you might come to a deep understanding of these techniques. This legibility of the face depends not upon a mimetic representation of the actor's features, but rather on the coding of these features as signs. This rendering of the face as a semiotic field allows us to situate the problem of likeness, the likeness of the face, in relation to a broader system of signs. But with the apprehension of the face as a semiotic surface comes an attendant problem of legibility and the specter of misreading a print. There's an especially insightful examination of these linked problems of individuality, legibility, and misreading in Shikide Samba's 1806 book, Kejo Seigen Makono Soto, or Theater Beyond the Stage Curtain. Beyond the Stage Curtain begins with a group of provincial travelers led by Inakamono Tarozaemon, arriving in Edo on their way to the theater. Passing by the area near Oyajibashi, the group stops to puzzle out an actor print posted on the doorway of a restaurant. It reads, "Grandma," says one of the travelers, "isn't that Danjiro with his red face and small nose?" "It looks like a drunk who's drowned to death," replies Grandma. "I'll tell you who it is," interjects Tarozaemon. "It's Seigawa Hanshiro, the actor of villain." What's intended to be funny about this scene is that Tarozaemon, despite the confidence with which he corrects his fellow travelers, appears to be as clueless as anyone. At one level, the misreading of the print seems to point to a fundamental ignorance. They simply do not recognize the actor because they've not seen him on stage. But wedding together the names of two of the leading female impersonators of the time, Segawa Kikunojo and Iwai Hanshiro, and interpreting the figure as a player of male villain roles, a mistake compounded by the fact that the red makeup suggests the figure of a hero, not of a villain, suggests as well a different kind of ignorance, an ignorance of the codes on which representation rests. It's not just that the provincial travelers misrecognize the face in the print, but that the print remains completely illegible, that the codes through which interpretation might be possible are jumbled, and as the travelers puzzle over the print, they appear to be moving away from rather than towards an understanding of the codes on which interpretation relies. We see this concern over cultural legibility in Toyokuni's quick guide as well. He stresses not only the importance of capturing the distinctiveness of each actor's face, but also the importance of framing this face within the context of readily legible stage convention. So, for example, not only does Toyokuni provide slightly different models for sketching an actor's face in the role of a villain versus a hero, he also devotes several pages to the different hairstyles of different roles. And as he notes in the introduction, the color one will add to the likeness will depend on the makeup used in the role. There are various distinctions to facial makeup, he writes, and one should color the face only after careful consideration of the essence of the role. There's thus an interesting intersection in the quick guide, as indeed in the actor prints themselves, between the individuality of the actor's face and convention based on role type. But even as distinctiveness and stylization or convention seem in some way antithetical, both are linked to an impulse towards legibility or semiotic clarity. And indeed, in both instances, it is the emergence of difference against a field of stylization that allows for that difference to be read. The actor's image thus becomes a system of intersecting signs, some of which, patterns of makeup, hairstyle, costume, point to the actor's role within the drama and on the stage, and others which point beyond the stage to the actor himself in terms of his facial kusei. Properly reading the image involves deciphering both the actor represented and the role he's playing, and Samba's provincial travelers suggest how this deciphering can go awry. In Toyokuni's quick guide, if Toyokuni's quick guide addresses itself to the semiotics of the actor's image, a host of other works from this period address the grammar of role type. Although, as they appear in the pages of illustrated fiction, actors are presented without makeup, codification of patterns of makeup was an important subject in early 19th century writings on the culture of the stage, and there emerges in these writings an interesting tension between the preservation of makeup technique as privileged or secret knowledge that was supposed to be passed down within acting families, and an impulse towards making those patterns readily understandable to the general public. So, for example, the 1802 Yakusha Sanju Niso Tengankyo, or a magnifying glass of 32 actors' physiognomies, written by Toshi Shokyaku, with a preface by Kyokute Bakin and illustrated by Toyokuni, provides an extended discussion of theatrical makeup, framed as a secret transmission of this physiognomies, physiognomic art of reading complexions. In addition to a general introduction on the principles of physiognomy, the book contains a physiognomic reading of 32 actors' faces, and then a final section titled A Secret Transmission on Understanding Complexion. Each in its own way, these sections tackle the interpretation of the face and the reading of its features, but it's the discussion of theatrical makeup in the final section that throws into striking relief the issue of legibility. So not only does Shokyaku provide a general overview of the meaning of different combinations of makeup, but he also includes mingled into the text little sketches intended to provide to the reader a basic foundation for reading the face as it appears on stage. Thus, Shokyaku writes, "A white face on which the eyes are surrounded by red as such is the mark of an Aragota hero with great strength and heroism. When upon a face you see a pattern like this, it is known as Tsujikuma or line shadows, and is a mark of a great Aragota hero, as in Shibaraku or Yanone. Or when such sinews appear along with a freshly shaven pate, it is the visage of a hero at the end of the play, such as Tadanobu or Hongo Taro. A peach complexion with such sinews is that of a figure like Yahibyoe Munekiyo." The bulk of this work is devoted to the physiognomic description of the faces of individual actors, but here the emphasis shifts towards a second order of signs, an order that in very real sense forms a layer of convention that rests upon and overlays the individual faces of the actors, incorporating them into the readily legible world of stage convention. There is in Shikite Samba's Shibai Kinmozue, an illustrated encyclopedia of the theater published the following year in 1803, a similar discussion of makeup as physiognomy that provides an interesting counterpoint to Shokyaku's discussion. Samba's discussion of complexion tends similarly to Shokyaku's, although couched in the language of an explication of a foreign land that Samba uses throughout his encyclopedia. But then, when he turns the impulse to make legible for the reader the conventions of theatrical makeup, gives way to a brilliant discussion of the problem of moral legibility on the stage among characters in the play. So Samba writes, with blue faces, there are blue faces, light blue faces, faces with blue lines. And there are those on whom only the area around the eyes are blue. People of this hue are exceedingly devious and perverted. But the inhabitants of this land do not seem to notice and often reveal to these people the details of some important matter only later to regret it. Or else, although a person is in fact good, they are doubted and thus not confided. This often causes that person great consternation. Although it's said that one's heart is like one's face, meaning that an inconstant heart will be revealed on an inconstant face, there are many in this land with constant faces whose hearts are inconstant. At any rate, it's a most confusing country. What's crucial to the dramatic conventions about which Samba is writing is that there emerges an incommensurability between legibility as it functions on stage and the ability of the audience to read the signs and conventions as they appear. The audience, that is, can read the villainy and virtue of the characters that remain for the characters themselves illegible. And a gap emerges between the spectator who sees the evil quite clearly and quite literally written on the villain's face, and the innocent hero or heroine who seems always to misinterpret the signs of evil as signs of virtue and vice versa. These dynamics work somewhat differently on the printed page. As makeup patterns were secretly transmitted within acting families, they were not used in illustrated fiction, and these works rely instead on patterns of clothing and hairstyle, and on clearly marking the identity of each character as legible in each image. Thus, even when Hokkaibo is in disguise, the reader sees him clearly for who he is. That is to say, in this image, he's disguised as Tomo Inosuke, and that fact can't be deduced from his face, but it can be deduced from the fact that the character for Ho of Hokkaibo is written on his sleeve. So the character, even though Nowaki Hime can't distinguish the people, the reader will know that she's being deceived. So the problem of legibility, which surfaces in Toyo Kuni's quick guide as a question of distinguishing one actor from another, resurfaces in two striking ways on the stage. The first is the legibility of role type on the face of the actor as encoded in makeup. The second is the way that all manner of reading, and especially of misreading, are crucial to both the drama of Kabuki theater and to the fiction of this period. In his discussion of stage props in his illustrated Encyclopedia of the Theater, Samba suggests the way in which the deployment of various signs within the diegetic world of the play, signs which are invariably misread only in the end to be properly deciphered, functions within the plot structure of 19th century drama. So Samba notes, for instance, that there appear in this world of the theater many magical swords with various wondrous powers. Even when hidden away, a magical sword can cause, by means of its virtuous power, a base person to cower in fear and even to faint. But these swords, Samba notes, are often lost, as are, he continues, precious jewels and seals, which are so often used to forge, to counterfeit, and to cheat, seem, Samba writes, in this world stolen with particular ease and are constantly lost. And an object once lost or stolen is often then lost or stolen again. Within the plays and fiction of the 18th and 19th centuries, all of these objects, lost and stolen swords, jewels, and seals, function constantly as markers of identity, revealing a person's true identity or their culpability for a crime, or that they are in fact a long-lost son or daughter of a powerful lord. Here, what we might think of as the drama of legibility is quite literally enacted over and over again on the stage. Indeed, when one looks at the culture of the early 19th century from the perspective of the intersection of these various elements, in which the problem of legibility figures so centrally, it's hard not to see this culture as being in many ways structured by generalized preoccupation with the status of the legible. Almost all of these conventions, in one form or another, appear in Samba's Shadows of Kabuki. There's a stolen harp scroll, which leads to the downfall of the Toshima house, which is then stolen a second time. There's a debauched Hokkaibo who tries to seduce Nowaki Hime disguised as Tono Inosuke. For his part, Tono Inosuke has fallen in love with the courtesan Miyato, who we learn at the very end of the novel on her death is actually the long-lost twin sister of his betrothed Nowaki Hime. And what proves her identity is a stick of incense that was left with her when she was abandoned as a baby, and which is discovered at her death. In the end, all misrecognition and misreading are banished, and it is the light cast by two magical objects, the statue of Canon and the carp scroll, that functions to restore proper moral order to the world of the novel. The emergence then of legibility as a crucial matter within the culture of the early 19th century suggests an anxiety or ambiguity, an anxiety central to the staging of the drama of legibility within Kabuki, an anxiety that cultural codes once legible, or what's more probably the case, codes that have been imagined to have been once clearly and naturally legible, are understood to be embedded, contingent, and ambiguous. That the drama of this time so often revolves around mistaken interpretations of a sign which are later clarified is itself suggestive of a nostalgic impulse towards a lost or imagined world of authentic legibility, in which misrepresentation and misreading are banished, as they are at the end of Shadows of Kabuki. Early 19th century intuitions of representation seem caught between these poles, between an open acknowledgement of codes that make up representation possible on the one hand, and on the other hand, a not yet entirely abandoned ideal of a representation that transcends the fragile contingency of the viewer and aspires to authentic, unmediated legibility on the other hand. By way of conclusion, I'd like to situate this discussion within a more concrete world of cultural consumption in the 19th century. I first encountered Samba's Shadows of Kabuki among a list of titles in the catalog of a family library collected over the 19th century in the provincial town of Tsumago in the Kiso Valley, compiled by Suzuki Toshiyuki in the 1990s. For many, the image of the Kiso Valley, which lies roughly halfway between Edo and the Kamigata region of Osaka and Kyoto, is likely to be linked to Shimazaki Tosan's epic novel Before the Dawn, Yoake Mae, published between 1929 and 1935. Part of what drives the narrative of Tosan's novel is the sense of the valley's isolation and its lateness, as the novel's protagonist, Aoyama Hanzo, struggles to catch up to the changes sweeping Japan in the wake of the coming of the West. But what's so striking about the library of the Hayashi household is not how it seems to represent a kind of cultural backwardness and distance from Edo, but almost the opposite. It's a world in which the culture, and especially the literary and theatrical culture of Japan's great metropolis, appears to have and very little impediment or delay. This culture, of course, arrives in the form of books and other printed matter. The range of books in the library is quite broad, but the library has dominated what Suzuki describes as books for leisure, fiction, and plays. When I first encountered the catalog of the Hayashi Library, I was working on the history of fiction in 19th century Japan, but I was immediately struck by what the library might tell us about the theatrical culture of this period. One of the most interesting aspects of the theatrical works in the collection is that they appear to present a kind of dualistic structure of how drama circulated beyond the stage and beyond the city in 19th century Japan. On the one hand, there are a large number of scripts from the puppet theater of Joruri, all but one of which were printed and published. On the other hand, there are only 2 Kabuki scripts, both of which were hand copied. In the place of scripts, however, the library contains a large collection of printed playbills, 42 in all, from Kabuki performances in the city of Edo between 1848 and 1874. Here we see one of the most important features of how drama was produced, circulated, and consumed in early modern Japan, defined by a contrast between the 2 major theatrical forms of this period, Joruri and Kabuki. In contrast to the libretti of both No and the puppet theater, the scripts of Kabuki were not printed or published. They circulated only in manuscript and not very widely until the end of the 19th century. But as the collection of playbills hints, in contrast to this manuscript culture, defined in many ways by privileged, often secret, hereditary knowledge, the world of the Kabuki stage was in almost every other way dominated, even defined by print. From the 19th century alone, there exist thousands of actor prints, actor critiques, illustrated playbills, and synopses, maps and guides for the theater district, calendars, lists of salaries, rankings of actors, theatrical genealogies, and a whole variety of ephemera privately commissioned and printed by fan clubs. It is this material that constitutes the archive of 19th century Kabuki in print, and it's this that's really the subject of the book that I've written. And yet, despite the proliferation of printed matter, or in part because of this very proliferation, a counterpoint emerges in the work of early 19th century writers most deeply intertwined with theater culture. Even as all manner of printed objects proliferated, there emerged an idea of an authentic experience of performance that somehow eluded the printed page. In much of Samba's writing on the stage, he points directly to the various gaps and omissions that must exist in any written treatment of the stage, the subject that he puts forth in Shadows of Kabuki. Samba was a devoted fan of the theater and himself a collector of theater ephemera, and his fiction is littered with theatrical themes and subjects. But Samba was also, perhaps more than any of his contemporaries, a creature of the world of print and of books. In his early 20s, he would become a successful writer, but Samba's relationship with print began almost at birth. His father, Kikuchi Mohe, was a woodblock carver, and later in life, he would carve blocks for several of his son's works. At the age of 8, Samba was adopted into the house of the publisher Horinoya, and later he married into another publishing family, the Yorozuya, and even spent some time as a used book dealer. And yet throughout his writing, Samba expresses a profound ambivalence towards the world of print, and especially towards how the culture of writing was being shaped by increased commercialization and by the tastes and desires of new readers, especially readers in the provinces. At one level, then, the presence of Shadows of Kabuki in the Hayashi Library seems to become almost symbolic of the very problem that the work flags. It is the embodiment of the book in print that allows it to travel to the provinces, allows it to be preserved as part of a library, allows it to be rediscovered by the scholar 2 centuries later. If the printed page becomes a shadow, kind of shadow cast by the performance, a medium that seems always inadequately to grasp and represent the stage, and still through this medium, in the form of this shadow, that the stage was available to the provincial consumer, in other words, to the provincial reader. Indeed, the Hayashi Library seems to suggest a disjuncture between the consumption of the theater in the provinces, always and inevitably mediated through print, and its consumption in the city of Edo itself as performance. And yet, in many ways, the experience of the theater in Edo was itself mediated by print, as Samba himself suggests in Beyond the Stage Curtain, when the provincial travelers stop to puzzle over the act of print. Here, their first encounter with the theater, indeed, their first encounter with the city, is mediated by a printed image. They come to Edo to view the theater, but what they encounter is not the theater, but the representation of the theater in print, not unlike the readers in the provinces. Indeed, part of the intelligence of Samba's work is that he keeps circling back to the role that printed matter, actor prints, ephemera, theater books play in shaping the theater-going experience, even as a playgoer crosses the threshold into the playhouse itself. Indeed, in this scene, as in Samba's Makame Soto of the provincial playgoers attempting to puzzle out the meaning of the act of print, is just one of several scenes in the work in which printed ephemera of various sorts plays an important role in defining the nature of the experience of theatergoers in the city of Edo. Just before the scene takes place, Samba begins his discussion of the sites of the theater district by invoking how the first performances of the new year vie with one another on the walls of the barber shop in the form of prints, with the three theaters competing with one another to deliver broadsheets of the acting troops to the tea houses. The theaters and their actors are embodied here in printed broadsheets and pamphlets, or again, when Inakamono and his companions arrive at the theater district, they encounter the reading of a ranking of actors and their salaries from a printed broadsheet, which Grandpa mistakes for the reading of a family registry. Even within the theater itself, Samba describes a vendor selling various kinds of printed ephemera, and there's a discussion in which one theatergoer suggests to another that he referred to Samba's own Shibai Kinmozui, the satirical encyclopedia of the theater that the author had published 3 years earlier. In the provinces, the theater can only be consumed through its embodiment in print, but as Samba's travelers make their way into Edo, into the theater district, and even into the playhouse, the experience of theater going continues to be mediated by printed texts and images. Indeed, what's most striking about Samba's novel is that it leads not inexorably towards the performance itself, Rather, as the title Beyond the Stage Curtain suggests, the novel is focused entirely on what happens among the audience. There is, that is to say, no description of what actually happens on stage. There is no there. In Shadows of Kabuki Cast by Magic Lantern, Samba meditates at length on the way that the printed book appears as a kind of shadow of the play it purports to represent on the page, but also questions the very duality of the real and the shadow, original and copy. If at one level he suggests the work can be thought of as a shadow cast by the play, the book is a separate narrative and as a physical object itself that can be held in the hand and read becomes its own reality rather than merely the disembodied play that exists now only in the shadow it casts on various printed objects, that it seems to stand in a spectral relationship to reality. This insight from 2 centuries ago seems to present a remarkably useful way to think about the spectral nature of the digital archive and its relationship to things of which it appears to be a shadow. For just as Samba's own work is marked by deep ambivalence, a sense of mourning of the loss of an imagined authentic experience, as well as an acknowledgement that shadows may in fact be more real than the objects which cast them, so too in our digital age defined by a similar set of anxious ambivalences that both embrace the power and the possibility of the digital record and posit a sense of nostalgia for a lost authenticity of the experience of the scholarly past. In a strange and completely unexpected way, Samba's shadow cast by Magic Lantern played a pivotal role in my thinking about these problems as I finished writing my book. I'd first come across the book's title and a catalog of materials owned by the Hayashi household in Tsumago, as I mentioned, and my access to the book itself was provided by a copy that had been digitized by Waseda University Library. But several years ago, I was able to travel to Tsumago to examine the copy that had been held in the Hayashi family library, as well as other theatrical materials. At this point, I had largely drafted the body of the book and had begun to think seriously about the question of what it meant to be finishing a book in a moment very much defined by the ease of access brought about by digitization. When I finally made arrangements to see the books, I did so in part in the context of a specific lack of access. The books, though cataloged, had remained in the storehouse of the Hayashi family and had never been photographed or digitized. To see them meant to travel to Tsumago to make arrangements and to be granted permission of access by Hayashi Bunzo, the current head of the Hayashi house, which still owns the books. At the level of content, I knew what was contained in almost all of the materials in the collection, but these books and playbills were distinct in part precisely because they were something to which I did not have easy access, a subject that demanded a particular kind of attention and planning. Their singularity lay within their situatedness, in a place and in a space, in a storehouse in the mountains, as part of a collection of objects that had been owned and read by a specific person, and perhaps I hoped had been marked by her hand in some way that would be meaningful. The traces of a reader that would open up a different horizon of interpretation. In an age defined by digitization and easy access to all manner of materials, there was something fascinating about the objects which had yet to be digitalized. Singular not in their content, but in their location and the uses that someone had made of them. So several things happened. First, try as I might, I was unable to actually locate a number of the items in the catalog, despite the fact that apparently no one had looked at the collection again since it was first cataloged. The book I most wanted to see, the copy of Shadows of Kabuki cast by Magic Lantern housed in the collection, was one of the books I simply could not locate. And many, indeed most of the playbills collected across the 19th century were also missing. Having traveled to Tsumago with the hope of finding some specific way of addressing, of thinking about these unique copies and what they meant for a particular reader, and then for me as a historian, I was left quite literally empty-handed. At the same time, as I worked through the collection, I was confronted with various traces of the historical reader. There were there was a beast whose head had been removed as it was struck by a hero. There were doodles, a set of armor, a kind of phallic-looking beast, and even within the pages of one book, a leaf that had been perfectly preserved for a century and a half. You can't have leaves, but it's but most of these markings were unintelligible. except at the most basic level, that they mark the presence of a reader, but which reader and when was completely lost to history. Most of the books bear stamps from commercial lending libraries, often more than one, and it's never clear whether the markings we are encountering today can be attributed to a specific historical reader like Hayashi Kuni, the theater-mad young woman of the provinces who we understand to have collected these books, or were the remnant of the book's prehistories as objects that circulated widely in the collections of lending libraries. In retrospect, what strikes me most about the experience is how it was itself an uncanny repetition of one of the central themes of Samba's book, the relationship between ephemerality of performance and its record as a kind of shadow. Was my own relationship to the missing book and to the digitized copy that became my stand-in not in its own way a repetition of the central problem of how any text stands in a ghostly relationship to the ephemerality of performance? In one of the final scenes of Shadows of Kabuki cast by Magic Lantern, the ghosts of the debauched priest Hokkaibo and his victim Miyatogawa, the long-lost twin of Nowake Hime, are driven away by the light cast from two magical objects, a statue of Kannon from the Sensoji Temple in Asakusa, and a carp scroll in the hand of the Emperor Wu of Han China. Just in discussion of the novel, this final drama of light and shadow, ghostly presence, and its foretold absence is at any level immensely rich for thinking about Samba's own intuition of the relationship between print and performance, page and subject, which itself hangs over this novel like a ghostly presence. But here I'd like to focus not on Samba's novel itself, but on a minor detail of the copy of the novel that was digitized by Waseda University and that had once belonged to Tsuboichi Shoyo. Just as the scene unfolds, someone has written in by hand repeatedly in the voice of the ghosts, Urameshi, Urameshiya, a kind of haunting lament of resentment. There's a strange doubleness to this lament, for it also marks the ghostly presence of the reader, a reader now lost to history other than in his or her marginalia, which has been preserved in a way the reader could never have imagined by digitization, a ghostly embodiment of the enduring ephemeral of our own digital age. The lament is also a reminder of the singularity of the individual book, a block-printed text that has been made unique by the intervention of the human hand. And it's hard at this point not to recall the missing copy of the same book in the Hayashi collection, what traces of the text may have borne that, at least for now, have completely disappeared. And these are just two other copies of the same book where you can see that the handwritten marginalia is missing from printed copies. If this this uncanny presence of the historical reader in the voice of the textual ghost is useful for reflecting back on the themes that I've tried to elucidate over the course of this talk. It is because it is a reminder of the very complexities of any attempt to interrogate the historical record. The digitized version of Tsuboichi Shoyo's copy of Kabuki no Omokage is not an adequate substitute for the missing copy of the Hayashi family library. Fundamentally, it's not a substitute at all. But that is really Samba's own point in his work. If the novel is a shadow cast by the stage, it's not at the level of substitution that the process works, but by something perhaps more like surrogation, what Joseph Roach has described as the doomed search for originals by continuously auditioning stand-ins. Indeed, just as performance stands in for the elusive entity that it is not, but that it must vainly aspire both to embody and to replace, so too the relationship between text and performance, or between between text and its digitization, are part of this same continual process. If we intuit that is the digitized document not primarily as a copy of the original whose richness it always fails adequately to represent, but as itself a stage in the process of surrogation, we can more fully engage in the complexity of what the digital archive represents for the scholar. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zwicker, for this really interesting and rich talk. A lot of very engaging visuals as well, and stories and such a rich material. I'm looking at the Q&A session because I would like to start with questions from the audience. I don't see any open questions, and I would at this point really highly encourage our audience to please post your questions. We have the first one coming in, and there will be more from me as well, but maybe I'll wait with my own questions until the end if we have time left. So let me start with the first that are coming in from Olivia Nagorski, and there's several of them. When we talk about likeness, is that the sole, thank you very much for the great talk. When we talk about likeness, is that the sole translation of the Nigao, or can one also consider portrait as long as one provides the contextual explanation? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, this is a great question in part because it highlights the importance of the attention to language that shows up, right, in any period when you're trying to understand these problems of semblance, resemblance, likeness, copy, and so forth. In other words, there is a sort of field of language, a field of terms of discourse, which in some ways are distinct from one another, in some ways overlap with one another. And it's really in the process of parsing that language that I think the really interesting aspects emerge. So just to give a couple of examples of words that show up in the materials that I've looked at or showed today, as well as some other pieces that come up in the book that I mentioned. So of course, nigao or nigao-e is one of the terms that shows up and is very important in this period and suggests an idea of semblance or likeness. The term kusei, which I mentioned, right, which now we in modern Japanese we tend to associate with a certain kind of like how to put it, kusei is like like almost it could be a written or verbal tick, for example, or some kind of a something like that. In Torakuni's writing, it refers specifically to a facial feature, that the kusei is a feature of the face. Which suggests a certain kind of distinctiveness or individuality, although both distinctiveness and individuality are reading onto that term ideas which have a certain kind of modern ring to them. And so one wants to be careful in how one thinks about it. The term sugata and sugata-e both show up in referring to images within fiction that represent characters that are being depicted on the images. That is to say, image-bearing images within illustrations. And so perhaps, right, sugata or a sugata could be thought of as portrait in those particular instances. And then the other term that shows up in Samba's work that I mentioned is ninsogaki, or kind of physiognomical description, either in words as it was used in mostly the Edo period, or in images as it's used in Samba's own writing. So I guess for me, I try in my own work, rather than to think of what necessarily is the best translation, to think of a certain kind of field of overlapping possibilities, and to think about the relationship between and among those. Why is it, for example, that the term kusei shows up repeatedly in Toyokuni's writing? What is the relationship between the term sugata and a sugata, which are sometimes used interchangeably, but sometimes seem to be used distinctively? Why is it that the term nigao-e, for example, or nigao doesn't appear within the fiction, even though it's used as a descriptor in extra fictional discourse to refer to the kinds of practices that the illustrations are based on? Which to me is quite interesting, that term isn't used in the fiction, and instead things like ninso or a sugata-e are used. So anyway, I think what you're getting at is a really interesting question, as you suggest. Providing contextual explanation is, I think, precisely the way to go when you're dealing with those kinds of complicated, not really linguistic problems, but actually historical or questions of historical meaning. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. Thank you, Olivia, as well, for the questions. We have more questions from Olivia. Shall we proceed with them? Maybe we can continue with this, and then if there's no questions from other members of the audience, and I may be asking my questions because I have one I'm very curious about, and then we can continue. So the second question from Olivia is, you mentioned a particular story by Shigete Sanba about a false deciphering of the, would you please write again which story that was exactly? Thank you very much. So it's very specific clarification thing.
Oh, right. Yes. So it's a work referred to, the title of which is, sorry, let me look at my notes. It's, oh yeah, the Japanese title is Kejo Suigen Makono Soto.
Yeah.
It's a slightly unusual reading of the kanji that are used for the title. So the easiest thing would be to look it up in something like the Kokubungaku Kenkyu Shiryokan's Kokusho Somokuroku, the database, by just typing in the kana, and I think then you'll be able to get it. It's been that particular text is anthologized in modern editions. So you can also probably just search for it in a library database as well.
Thank you. Thank you for your answers. I suggest there were more questions from Olivia, but maybe we can take it offline, or if there's questions, if there's time left, we can return to them, because we have questions from Frank Chance as well, and from Tian Gao. From Frank, the question: in modern times, people sometimes complain if the food served in a restaurant does not sufficiently replicate the models in the display window or pictures in the menu. Did critics or viewers complain that the actors on the stage did not sufficiently resemble the images in the prints or other nigaware?
It's an interesting question, and it's difficult to answer in terms of what evidence has been transmitted to us in the present. But I would make one comment about it, which may get to the problem, which is that although we think about Nigao as somehow representing what's transpiring on stage, there's two disjunctures in the way that actors' likenesses were actually made in relation to performance, which are quite interesting in their own right and quite important in thinking about the very interesting question that you asked. So the first is that although actor prints like what's now called like shibae or yakushae, that is to say prints of characters on stage in role, we think of them sometimes as representing what actually happened on stage, but actually in most instances they were made before the performance was done, in anticipation of the performance, so they could be sold on opening day. And we know that for various reasons, but including the fact that they're prints that were made of performances that never took place because the actor got sick and was substituted by a different actor. And sometimes they just kind of carved out the head of one actor and put in the head of the other actor and went on with the print as such. So in that sense, there really is a disjuncture between the creating of the image and then its relationship to what happens on stage. But I think the question you're asking is a little bit different from that, which is to say, right, most people will have first encountered the image through print, and then when they finally get to the stage, there may actually be a gap between what they thought the actor looked like and what they actually looked like. That's something I've never seen commented upon. That doesn't mean that it didn't exist or that there was never any evidence of it. It's just that I've never seen any evidence survive that gets to that question, but it's quite an interesting problem. Yeah.
Thank you. Let's move to the next question from Tiangao. Thank you so much for your wonderful talk. I would like to ask about books that retell the story from a kabuki play but are not based on any particular performance. For example, some gokan about Chushingura who doesn't employ actors' likeness and do not provide information about the theaters. I was wondering, how would you see the connection between these kind of books with kabuki play? Thank you.
Yeah, so there's again a really important question to get at. So the relationship between Gokon in particular, that is the illustrated fiction of the 19th century kusuzoshi, and theater is quite complicated, as this question points out. Sometimes there's a conceit that the Gokon is actually basically the play sort of sonomama, right? It's a transcription of the play. I write about that conceit at one point in my book in relation to a problem revolving around the nature of authorship in the 19th century. But as you point out, there are many, many, many instances. And in fact, the book that I talk most about today by Shikute Samba, this one on the page here, The Shadows of Kabuki cast by Magic Lantern, as I suggested, it sort of frames itself as being based on a play, but it's not actually based on a play. The most important aspects of the story don't appear in the play at all. And so the relationship between the play and the story is much more complicated than the idea of it being a direct transcription of the play. There's also a category of fiction from especially the early half, the earlier half of the 19th century. I think it begins around 1915 or so. Sorry, 1815 or so, which you may be aware of and alluding to with your question, which is fiction that actually depicts the stage itself as part of the fictional world. That is to say, rather than just showing the characters going about their business, occasionally, and the sort of the first example is Shohon Jitate by Ryutei Tanehiko. Instead of it just being about the story, occasionally the picture will be drawn in such a way that you see the stage, right? That there's the fictionality, artificiality, theatricality of the picture becomes part of the image itself, and therefore part of the reading experience of the story. So I guess what I would say is that there's a couple of things. I mean, one is to be careful about the specific work that you're talking about, but also thinking about how these things shift over time, both in relationship to convention, but also in relationship to legal issues going on. For example, after the Tempo reform, laws change about what can and can't be depicted about the stage. And so the way in which a work may purport to or self-identify itself as copying a theatrical performance may be impacted importantly by that. So again, I guess I would just go back to the idea of sort of looking at the specificity of the particular object that you're thinking about, and then inserting that into this longer history of the problems of representation.
Thank you. Next question from Stephen Forrest. Thank you for a very rich talk. I'm interested in the role of the magic lantern as a relatively new technology, giving Samba a way of conceiving the duality you outline, especially as a parallel to the way digital tech has given us a new way of imagining books that would have been invisible to us around 2000. Does Samba have other references to this technology?
Yeah, I would have to look through my notes to find the specific titles, but yeah, I mean, as you may be aware, the Magic Lantern is as a device. I don't mean as an actual historical device, but as a device within image making and as a device within fiction and rhetoric and so forth, used fairly broadly from the end of the 18th century forward. I think Timon Screech has an interesting discussion of this in one of his books. I think it was his earliest book on vision in the 18th century. I'm forgetting the title right now. But there is a relatively widespread use of the conceit of the magic lantern in various ways around the sort of turn of the 19th century. Yeah.
Thank you. And I think the next one is more of a comment or suggestion rather than a question from Doug Walters. Thank you for an interesting talk. Do you think it would be good if CJ could do a future Kabuki play, near Norwich? Well, I think it's a very good idea. I think we will think about it. May I sneak in my own?
I would say, I'm not responsible for planning it, but it would be great. Yeah.
Yes, it would be nice. Can I at this point maybe sneak in my own question, and which is because my background is more in the calligraphy and really text and image relationships. And I think it's really interesting when we're talking about the printed matters and, you know, printed books related to performances, and because there's also a lot of calligraphy in there, whether there is any traces of performativity in the text. Because we know that, for example, in Zen narratives and scripts and so forth, there's attempts to incorporate performativity into the calligraphy. Sometimes it indicates the rhythm, sometimes it's the, you know, the pace of the movement and narratives. And of course, in the illustrated books that you showed, there's a lot of image and text, but do you notice something going on with script and writing specifically to kind of enhance the the visuals or the performativity and things like that? Because also the relationship between kabuki and calligraphy and script, and we know things about the kanteiryo and things like that, is very rich tradition there too.
Yeah, I mean, this is a really interesting question. I don't think I'm going to be able to give you a great answer off the top of my head, but there are a couple of things that come to mind immediately, which are related to this and which I'd have to think a little bit more about. But it's a really interesting question. So the first is there are lots of really important and interesting scenes of calligraphic writing in kabuki plays. And as those plays are depicted in images, both you know, prints, but also even in bansuke, that is to say, playbills and so forth. So, I mean, looking at the performance of calligraphic writing in kabuki would be a super interesting topic. It's not something I've thought specifically about, but I think it would be getting at some of the questions that you raise about the relationship between writing or the idea of writing a certain kind of performative act. I think there's really because many of the scenes of writing that you see are somewhat unusual. Someone writing with the brush between her teeth, for example, and thinking about that in that way, I think it's a really rich question. The other thing that comes to mind, which is maybe a little bit different from what you're asking, but a subject that interests me a great deal and which I write about, not in terms of the calligraphic exactly, but in other ways, is the relationship between print and manuscript in the 19th century. So, you know, oftentimes we think of this as a kind of one-way street. That is to say, manuscript precedes print, and, you know, we go from woodblock to, you know, kansuji in the modern period and so on. But as we all know, manuscript continues to be very, very important in the age of print, not just in Japan, but everywhere in the world, and often precisely because it serves as a demarcation of those who are inside and those who are outside. So one of the things that actually quite interests me about this period is there is an anxiety. I don't want to necessarily associate specifically with ideas of class and status as existed in the Edo period, because it's slightly different from that. But there is an anxiety over the availability of culture based on print to a very wide consuming audience, and what it means to circumscribe that availability through the circulation of manuscript objects. So those objects could be calligraphic in nature and are in some of the instances that I've seen. They could be other kinds of objects, a doll, for example. They could be the manuscript copying of a printed book, but a printed book that's no longer in circulation. For example, a 17th century edition, which has become very rare, is then copied in manuscript and circulated among friends. So yeah, I think there is in the 19th century, which is a period that I know best, definitely an interest in the handwritten as precisely the non-reproduced. And yet you do have, of course, right, the reproduction of calligraphy and printed texts as well. So that process or boundary, I don't know, it's not process and boundary, neither of them are the right words, but that sense of interrelationship between the two is a very, very interesting and rich problem for this period, for sure.
Thank you so much for the great talk and also for Q&A session. Looking at the time, I'm afraid we will have to wrap up our session here because we came to the end of the session. There are more questions in the Q&A box which we weren't able to answer live. but I hope we can follow up offline because we can keep those questions for later. That would be great. Thank you everybody for joining, and our sincere thanks go to Dr. Zwicker for his insightful talk. We will include a report on this lecture in our next e-bulletin, which will be released in early February. Once the webinar concludes, you may receive an email from Zoom tomorrow containing a link to a feedback form, or it may appear in your browser window after this session. We highly value your input, and your comments help us continually improve this lecture series. For our February 3rd Thursday lecture, our Executive Director of the Sainsbury Institute, Professor Simon Kainer, will bring to you a report and some responses to the January 1st earthquake, which devastated the Noto Peninsula of the Kanazawa Prefecture. His focus will be on the impact on arts and cultures of the region, and please join us for this online session on Thursday, February the 15th. This year also marks the 25th anniversary since the founding of the Sainsbury Institute, and we look forward to bringing you a full program of events and activities to celebrate this. Further details will be announced very soon. Third Thursday lectures, which have been running since 2001, are greatly supported by our funders, Yakult UK, the Great Britain Sasakawa Foundation, and the Gatsby Charitable Foundation. The Sainsbury Institute wishes to thank our funders and our audiences for supporting this lecture series. Thank you for joining us tonight. Thank you, Dr. Zwicker, for a wonderful talk, and have a good evening. Thank you. Thank you so much.